The origins of the siege at Kholm are rooted in the wider strategic failure of Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. By early 1942, the rapid German advance that had brought Wehrmacht units deep into Soviet territory had stalled under the pressure of fierce Soviet resistance, logistical overextension, and the onset of the brutal Russian winter. What had begun as a lightning campaign to destroy the Red Army and force a Soviet collapse had transformed into a grinding war of attrition. It was within this shifting strategic context that the small town of Kholm, located in the Novgorod region of northwestern Russia, emerged as a focal point of fierce combat. Kholm was a modest town with limited military value in peacetime, but its location on the Lovat River made it a logistical node within the broader German defensive system on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht's Army Group North, which had been tasked with taking Leningrad, was by January 1942 heavily engaged across a stretched front line. Soviet counteroffensives had begun in earnest following the failure of the German advance on Moscow, and the Red Army was determined to reclaim lost territory and exploit weaknesses in German lines. The German 16th Army, under Generaloberst Ernst Busch, was responsible for holding this sector. As Soviet forces launched localized offensives to destabilize German positions, the area around Kholm became vulnerable to encirclement. Poor infrastructure, inadequate reserves, and the winter climate had strained the German ability to respond quickly. Local commands had to rely heavily on hastily assembled Kampfgruppen, ad hoc battle groups, comprised of remnants from various divisions. On January 18, 1942, elements of the Soviet Third Shock Army initiated operations aimed at cutting through German lines and severing critical supply routes in the region. Their target included the town of Kholm, where a patchwork force of roughly 5,000 German troops and support personnel, under the command of General Major Theodor Scherer, would soon find themselves completely surrounded. The besieging force consisted of infantry, artillery, and support units operating under the broader direction of the Northwestern Front's offensive plan to retake key urban and rural positions lost in the previous year. The defenders at Kholm were not elite units. They included police battalions, Luftwaffe ground personnel, rear echelon troops, and elements from regular Wehrmacht units that had been forced back by the Soviet advance. Despite this, Scherer quickly organized an improvised but cohesive defensive perimeter within the town's limits. Communication lines with higher command were unreliable, and air resupply would soon become the only connection to the outside world. The siege of Kholm should not be viewed in isolation, but as a reflection of the broader German strategic dilemma at the start of 1942. The High Command in Berlin, led by Hitler and OKH, faced a critical shortage of mobile reserves. Instead of consolidating gains, German forces were now required to hold static positions across vast and hostile terrain. The Kholm pocket would soon serve as a grim microcosm of the larger conflict on the Eastern Front, one marked by extreme endurance, tactical improvisation, and ideological rigidity on both sides. As Soviet pressure increased, Kholm became one of several pockets encircled by Red Army advances, alongside the more famous Demyansk pocket to the northeast. However, Kholm's defenders were far fewer in number and far more isolated. The Luftwaffe was ordered to maintain aerial supply missions to these trapped garrisons, a strategy that would later influence decisions at Stalingrad. The town itself offered little in the way of shelter or defensive depth, and the encirclement would soon test the limits of what a cut-off garrison could endure in the face of overwhelming odds. This was not a battle for conquest or territorial gain. It was a fight for survival. For the Germans, holding Kholm became a matter of prestige and ideological willpower. For the Soviets, it was a step in the long campaign to reclaim every inch of occupied soil. As winter deepened and the lines of encirclement tightened, the stage was set for one of the most grueling and unlikely defensive efforts of the Second World War. The siege of Kholm formally began on January 23, 1942, when Soviet forces completed their encirclement of the town. Within hours, the fragile outer positions of the German defenders were overwhelmed, forcing them to fall back to a compressed, hastily fortified perimeter within the town. General Major Theodor Scherer, a career officer with extensive frontline experience, assumed overall command of the pocket. His leadership would prove decisive in maintaining cohesion among the garrison, which was composed of disparate units unfamiliar with coordinated defensive operations. The first days of the siege were chaotic. The Soviets launched repeated frontal assaults, attempting to overrun the garrison before it could stabilize its lines. These initial attacks were repelled, but at great cost to the defenders, who lacked heavy weapons, armor support, and sufficient manpower to man a continuous front. Instead, Scherer established a flexible network of strongpoints, buildings, trenches, and barricades that allowed small groups to hold off superior forces in localized engagements. The urban terrain worked to the defenders' advantage, compensating in part for their numerical inferiority. One of the critical challenges from the outset was supply. The garrison had only a limited stockpile of food, ammunition, and medical equipment, and no access to additional resources on the ground. Scherer radioed for assistance, and within days, the Luftwaffe began organizing airdrops to resupply the Kholm pocket. Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft, operating from makeshift airfields miles away, braved Soviet anti-aircraft fire and difficult weather conditions to deliver crates of supplies. These drops were often imprecise and scattered, but they provided a lifeline that allowed the garrison to continue resisting. Conditions inside the pocket deteriorated rapidly. The temperature frequently fell below -30 degrees Celsius, and frostbite became a leading cause of injury. Makeshift hospitals were established in basements and cellars, but lacked anesthetics, surgical tools, and sufficient bedding. Water was scarce and had to be melted from snow. Fuel for heating was in short supply. Soldiers and civilians alike suffered from starvation and exposure. Despite these conditions, discipline was maintained through a rigid command structure and Scherer's insistence on daily reports, inspections, and a visible leadership presence. The Soviet forces encircling Kholm were under the operational control of the 3rd Shock Army, commanded by General Lieutenant Maxim Purkayev. They initially expected the pocket to collapse within days and were unprepared for the tenacity of the German defense. Repeated Soviet assaults focused on breaking through from multiple directions, often supported by artillery and mortar fire. However, the defenders' knowledge of the terrain and their defensive fortifications made each advance costly. Soviet troops were forced to clear house by house, encountering fierce resistance in every block. The German High Command took note of the unexpected resilience of the Kholm garrison. While their primary concern remained the larger Demyansk pocket, the defense of Kholm began to acquire symbolic importance. Propaganda outlets seized on Scherer's leadership, portraying the defenders as an example of German willpower and determination. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, commander of Army Group North, publicly praised the defenders and issued directives to maintain the airlift at all costs. This increased visibility ensured the garrison would not be forgotten, but it also heightened pressure on Scherer to hold out indefinitely. By early February, the situation remained dire. Soviet reinforcements, including artillery units and fresh infantry, continued to tighten the noose around the town. The Luftwaffe had managed to establish a makeshift airstrip on a frozen stretch of land near the town center, allowing for limited landings and evacuations, but it was under constant threat. Supplies remained insufficient, particularly ammunition for heavy weapons, which had to be rationed to the point of limiting artillery fire to only the most critical threats. Despite these conditions, morale within the pocket did not collapse. The defenders understood the stakes. Surrender meant likely execution or imprisonment, and evacuation was impossible. Orders were clear: hold at all costs. Daily life became a routine of vigilance, with rotating shifts in the trenches, constant repairs to damaged fortifications, and attempts to support wounded comrades with minimal resources. The front lines were sometimes only meters apart, and sniper fire and infiltration attempts became commonplace. The defenders of Kholm had managed to hold the line through the initial phase of the siege, but it was evident that their endurance would soon be tested further. The Red Army, frustrated by their failure to quickly seize the town, began planning more concentrated assaults. Meanwhile, The German command weighed whether it was even possible or necessary to continue defending such a small and isolated position. The next weeks would determine whether Kholm would become a forgotten outpost or a rallying point of resistance on the Eastern Front. As February advanced, the siege of Kholm transitioned into a brutal stalemate defined by attrition, aerial resupply, and unrelenting Soviet pressure. General Major Scherer's command faced not only a deteriorating tactical situation, but also the psychological and logistical strain of an encircled existence. The pocket, initially expected to fall within days, had now resisted for weeks. This unexpected longevity forced both German and Soviet high commands to reassess their operational priorities in the region. From the German perspective, the defense of Kholm had become both a tactical inconvenience and a strategic propaganda asset. On one hand, it diverted precious Luftwaffe transport resources that were also needed for the Demyansk pocket and other fronts. On the other, it provided a symbol of determination and tactical resilience that was broadcast across the Reich. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda eagerly published updates from the heroic defenders of Kholm, elevating General Scherer to near-mythic status among the German public. The garrison's ability to hold out despite overwhelming odds was portrayed as a reflection of German military superiority and ideological resolve. Behind the front lines, the Luftwaffe intensified its efforts to supply the pocket. Weather permitting, up to a dozen Ju-52s would attempt daily supply drops, delivering food, ammunition, fuel, medical kits, and winter clothing. The airstrip within the pocket, little more than a snow-covered field, was expanded to accommodate limited landings, yet every flight was a risk. Soviet anti-aircraft fire, poor visibility, and engine failure in sub-zero temperatures claimed many aircraft. Some flights were unable to locate the drop zones, scattering supplies across no man's land where Soviet troops could seize them. Inside the pocket, German troops adapted to the new normal of siege warfare. The town's infrastructure was systematically converted into a defensive network. Houses were fortified with sandbags, doors replaced with firing slits, and cellars transformed into supply depots or command posts. Communication between sectors was maintained via underground crawl spaces and improvised trenches dug through frozen ground. Every street became a potential battleground, and every building a fortress. Artillery shells and Soviet mortars reshaped the town's silhouette into a jagged, burned-out ruin. Soviet forces continued to mount daily assaults, probing for weaknesses and attempting to break through in force. These attacks were often preceded by artillery barrages that flattened entire blocks, leaving only shattered walls and smoldering beams. Following the bombardments, Soviet infantry units, often reinforced with sappers, would attempt to storm the German positions. The defenders, though short on ammunition, developed counter-tactics that relied on coordinated machine gun fire, well-camouflaged sniper teams, and grenade ambushes. The loss rate for Soviet units in these assaults was severe, but replacements continued to arrive. Civilian presence within the pocket further complicated the situation. Though most residents had fled or been evacuated during the initial Soviet advance, several hundred civilians remained trapped within the town. Scherer issued orders for their protection and attempted to integrate them into the garrison's daily survival efforts, clearing rubble, carrying supplies, or aiding the wounded. Food shortages, however, were severe. Rations were reduced to bare minimums, with dried bread, soup made from frozen vegetables, and occasionally horse meat forming the bulk of meals. The psychological burden of the siege was immense. German medical officers noted growing instances of combat fatigue, hallucinations, and emotional breakdowns. Nevertheless, unit cohesion held. Scherer instituted regular rotation schedules to allow frontline troops short rest periods, and chaplains moved through the lines offering spiritual support. Morale remained higher than expected, due in part to the constant, if limited, communication with the outside world via radio and occasional messenger aircraft. Meanwhile, Soviet command also faced internal debates. General Perkayev's superiors, dissatisfied with the slow progress, began pressuring for a breakthrough. Reinforcements were promised, including heavier artillery and more coordinated support from neighboring sectors. However, the terrain, the cold, and the sheer stubbornness of the German defense frustrated every effort. Kholm's fall, which had seemed inevitable in January, was now a grinding campaign with no clear end in sight. As February turned to March, both sides recognized that the siege had entered a new phase. No longer a quick engagement, Kholm was now a test of endurance, logistics, and morale. The Red Army began preparing for a larger offensive to crush the pocket once and for all, while the Germans clung to a fragile lifeline of air support and field improvisation. The longer the siege lasted, the more it risked becoming a symbolic struggle neither side could afford to lose. By mid-March 1942, the siege of Kholm had evolved into one of the most punishing and symbolically charged engagements on the Eastern Front. The Soviet command, increasingly frustrated by the pocket's persistence, escalated their efforts to eliminate it entirely. Reinforcements in the form of artillery brigades, infantry divisions, and engineers were concentrated around the town, with orders to crush the encircled defenders through coordinated, overwhelming force. Simultaneously, German High Command issued new directives. Kholm must be held at all costs, and its defense showcased as proof of German military resolve in the harshest conditions. The Soviet plan for the next phase involved a two-pronged strategy: intensified shelling to destroy remaining defensive structures and psychological warfare to break German morale. Daily artillery bombardments rained down upon the town, with Soviet batteries firing thousands of shells over several hours. Entire streets were obliterated, walls collapsed on sleeping soldiers, makeshift hospitals were buried under rubble. The psychological effect of the ceaseless shelling was profound, producing a state of constant tension and mental exhaustion among the defenders, yet the Germans held. Scherer, despite being wounded during a reconnaissance of frontline positions, continued to lead with strict discipline and unyielding resolve. His reports to Army Group North grew increasingly terse, often consisting of casualty figures, ammunition requests, and blunt confirmations. Position held, morale firm. Communication with Berlin continued through encrypted radio messages, and Hitler himself reportedly took a personal interest in the pocket's endurance, occasionally demanding updates from the OKH staff. The Luftwaffe, recognizing the danger posed by Soviet artillery now zeroed in on the airstrip, shifted to night drops and short landings, often under the cover of darkness or fog. Supply crates were now parachuted in with more accuracy, but many still landed in Soviet-controlled sectors. Crews flying the supply missions reported worsening conditions. Engines failed from extreme cold, air crews were fatigued, and flak damage was mounting. Yet the flights continued. The defense of Kholm was no longer a mere tactical consideration. It had become a matter of prestige. The Soviets, adapting to the determined German defense, launched a series of concentrated assaults aimed at breaking the pocket from multiple axes. One of the most intense came on March 18th, when Soviet sappers breached the southeastern sector of the town, initiating brutal house-to-house combat. German defenders responded with grenades, bayonets, and incendiary devices. The fighting devolved into chaos, with entire units wiped out in enclosed spaces. The Soviets were eventually repelled, but the cost was high. Dozens of defenders perished, and the area was reduced to a charred ruin. One of the most desperate innovations of the siege came during this period: the use of supply drops under fire. German supply planes began releasing small, individually marked packages targeted for specific units, relying on colored parachutes and signals from the ground to minimize loss. Meanwhile, inside the town, troops resorted to salvaging Soviet weapons and munitions captured during failed assaults. German engineers adapted mortars, repaired captured machine guns, and even constructed makeshift flamethrowers using fuel from downed aircraft. Medical care was nearly non-existent. The wounded often remained untreated for days, as overburdened medics prioritized cases with a higher chance of survival. Infection was rampant, and amputations were performed without anesthesia. Death became routine. Burials were impossible under constant shell fire, and frozen corpses accumulated in courtyards and alleyways, stacked against walls or placed in bombed-out cellars to preserve space. The civilian population, now reduced to fewer than 200, lived in appalling conditions. Huddled in basements with soldiers, they shared dwindling food supplies and endured the same bombardments. Disease spread rapidly through the cramped, unheated shelters. Yet reports suggest that many civilians assisted in the defense, volunteering for support tasks and resisting Soviet attempts to use them as informants. By late March, Soviet frustration was palpable. Despite superior numbers, firepower, and near-total encirclement, the town continued to resist. Perkayev's staff began planning a final push, concentrating additional artillery and preparing assault engineers for a decisive blow. German intelligence, through aerial reconnaissance and intercepted communications, became aware of the buildup. Army Group North authorized increased supply missions and even considered a risky breakout attempt, an option Scherer flatly rejected. There would be no retreat, no surrender. The men in Kholm knew they were isolated, but they also knew they were being watched by the entire German military apparatus. Failure would not only mean death, but the loss of a symbol, a hard-fought narrative of heroism and endurance that Berlin had carefully crafted. The final phase of the siege was approaching, and with it, the question of whether the defenders could withstand one more assault in a town already reduced to rubble and ash. As April began, the siege of Kholm reached its most desperate and punishing phase. The Red Army had committed to a final offensive intended to crush the pocket with a decisive, multi-directional assault. Intelligence from captured prisoners, reconnaissance flights, and radio intercepts suggested that Soviet command was preparing a massive artillery bombardment, followed by simultaneous infantry attacks from all surrounding sectors. For the German defenders, it was a moment of grim anticipation. The town had already endured more than 2 months of continuous siege. Now, every remaining building, every scrap of ammunition, and every able-bodied soldier would be called upon to repel what many believed would be the final blow. The Soviet preparation for the offensive was unmistakable. Artillery pieces and mortars, some dragged for miles through the mud and snow, were positioned on high ground overlooking the town. Soviet engineers worked day and night laying down additional trench lines, assembling pontoon bridges across the frozen Lovat River, and stockpiling ammunition for the coming bombardment. Observers on the German side reported constant movement beyond the perimeter, with Soviet patrols probing for weaknesses and identifying minefields. The psychological effect of this buildup was profound. Rumors spread among the garrison that the Soviets intended to level the entire town and kill or capture every last defender. On April 4th, the Soviet artillery assault began. Thousands of shells were fired in a continuous barrage lasting more than 6 hours. Every known German position was targeted. Trenches collapsed, bunkers were flattened, and entire city blocks were consumed in fire and smoke. The bombardment produced a soundscape of unimaginable violence. The screeching of incoming shells, the thunder of explosions, the cries of the wounded, and the grinding collapse of brick and wood. When the shelling stopped, the silence was as terrifying as the noise that had preceded it. The infantry assault followed immediately. Waves of Soviet troops surged forward, attacking from the north, east, and southeast. They advanced through smoke, debris, and ice, often unaware of the exact location of surviving German defenses. In some sectors, they encountered little resistance because there were no defenders left. In others, they were met with sudden concentrated fire from cellars, barricaded buildings, and concealed machine gun nests. Street fighting broke out in multiple areas simultaneously. Entire platoons were wiped out in sudden ambushes, only for the ground to be retaken minutes later by Soviet reinforcements. German coordination under such conditions was nearly impossible. Radio lines were down in several sectors, and runners were frequently killed before delivering messages. Scherer relied on pre-established contingency plans and delegated authority to junior officers, many of whom had assumed command after their superiors were killed. Units acted with autonomy, defending their immediate surroundings with the understanding that no reinforcements would be coming. Ammunition was rationed down to individual bullets. Some soldiers resorted to melee weapons and improvised explosives. The defenders were no longer fighting for strategic gain. They were fighting to avoid being annihilated. The Luftwaffe, alerted to the severity of the attack, attempted to increase the frequency of resupply missions. Several aircraft made landings or low-altitude drops during lulls in the fighting, but at least 3 were destroyed by Soviet ground fire, and others were forced to turn back. Still, some deliveries got through. Among the supplies were desperately needed medical kits, flare guns, and high-caliber ammunition that proved decisive in repelling some of the Soviet breakthroughs. By April 7th, the Soviet offensive had stalled. Though they had gained ground in several sectors, they had failed to destroy the pocket or capture the town center. Losses were severe. The Soviet command acknowledged that the German positions, despite being reduced to ruins, had held with extraordinary resilience. Perkayev's staff recommended a shift in strategy to reduce frontal assaults and return to siege tactics, artillery harassment, supply denial, and attritional pressure. Inside Kholm, the toll of the offensive was catastrophic. Entire units had been wiped out. Defensive lines were shattered and had to be reconfigured around whatever buildings still stood. Casualty rates among the wounded soared as the limited medical staff struggled to care for hundreds of new injuries with almost no supplies. Morale began to falter in some units, but Scherer responded with decisive measures: visible leadership, redistribution of rations, and strict enforcement of order. He rotated units to allow the most exhausted a few hours of rest and maintain nightly briefings to reinforce the sense of purpose. One of the few advantages the Germans retained was their knowledge of the terrain. After months of fortification, they knew every cellar, tunnel, and alley. This allowed them to stage limited counterattacks and even recapture key structures temporarily seized by Soviet troops. The psychological impact of these small victories helped stabilize morale and reinforce the message that surrender was not yet inevitable. By the second week of April, the battle had returned to a deadly equilibrium. The Soviets, having failed to achieve a breakthrough, returned to pressure tactics. The Germans, now holding a town that was more rubble than settlement, maintained their positions with fewer than 2,000 effective combatants. Every day brought new shelling, new casualties, and fewer supplies. But the pocket still held. Against all expectations, the garrison at Kholm had survived the heaviest Soviet assault yet, and in doing so extended a siege that had already entered the annals of military endurance. As April gave way to May, the siege of Kholm entered its longest and most punishing stage. The Soviet command, though frustrated by repeated failures to crush the pocket, refused to abandon the encirclement. Their strategy shifted toward slow strangulation rather than swift destruction. Artillery fire resumed on a near-continuous basis, while infantry patrols harassed the German perimeter without committing to full-scale attacks. Soviet snipers dug into buildings and tree lines, became a constant threat to anyone moving in daylight. Supplies dwindled further, and the German defenders found themselves relying on sheer willpower, improvisation, and an ever-narrowing sliver of aerial lifeline. The town itself had ceased to resemble a functioning settlement. It was now a cratered ruin of collapsed buildings, smoke-choked streets, and makeshift fortifications constructed from the rubble of homes and shops. The defensive perimeter was redrawn daily, with positions shifting based on new shell holes, destroyed strongpoints, and infiltration attempts. Despite constant adjustment, Scherer maintained a rigid internal structure, ensuring that each sector had an assigned officer, a fallback line, and a rotation plan, even if the fallback might be no more than a shattered courtyard or burned-out schoolhouse. One of the most significant threats at this stage was disease. Corpses, military and civilian, lay frozen in abandoned cellars, snowdrifts, and collapsed trenches. With spring thaw underway, decomposition began to spread illness. Dysentery, lice infestations, and respiratory infections swept through the garrison. There were no antibiotics, no functioning sanitation systems, and very few medical personnel. Bandages were reused, wounds were cauterized with heated metal, and field surgeries were performed without morphine. Yet Scherer insisted on maintaining hygienic routines where possible, boiling snow for water, rotating bedding, and burning contaminated clothing. The Luftwaffe, too, was nearing the limits of its ability to sustain the pocket. The broader Eastern Front was experiencing supply crises, and aircraft were needed for operations in Demyansk, Kharkov, and Crimea. Still, flights to Kholm continued, some days with only a few crates delivered by parachute, other days with short landings on the cratered strip near the river. Crews described the approach to Kholm as one of the most dangerous assignments of the war. Soviet AA fire was constant, fog and crosswinds unpredictable, and landing under fire a deadly gamble. Yet even a single crate of rifle cartridges or canned meat could mean the difference between survival and collapse. Inside the pocket, adaptation became a necessity. Troops scavenged everything: Soviet weapons from dead attackers, bricks from destroyed buildings, wire and nails from ruined fences. Entire squads were rearmed with Soviet submachine guns and ammunition stripped from enemy casualties. Sniper teams were created using captured Mosin-Nagant rifles. Booby traps were laid in basements and stairwells. Barricades were reinforced with sandbags filled with frozen earth and cloth torn from civilian bedding. Kholm had become a self-contained war machine running on whatever could be found, repaired, or repurposed. Despite the chaos, morale did not collapse. Scherer's presence remained a key factor. He regularly visited frontline positions, issued commendations, and personally delivered updated orders. His command post, located in a bombed-out building cellar, became the nerve center of the defense. Even as supply lists grew shorter and casualty reports longer, Scherer maintained the message. The garrison would hold, and relief would come. That message was not entirely without foundation. In the rear areas, German forces were reorganizing for a broader counteroffensive in the sector. Though the primary focus remained on relieving the larger Demyansk pocket, discussions within Army Group North included contingency plans for opening a corridor to Kholm. Still, terrain, weather, and Soviet pressure made such an operation unlikely in the immediate term. The men inside the pocket understood this. They no longer hoped for imminent rescue. They prepared for indefinite survival. The civilian population, now reduced to fewer than 100 individuals, was largely confined to the town's central cellars. They lived alongside soldiers, sharing rations, shelter, and danger. Children were rarely seen, but their cries could be heard at night under bombardment. Some civilians aided the defense directly, manning lookouts, carrying supplies, or caring for the wounded. Others simply tried to survive. There was no way out, no sanctuary, and no safe place left. For the Soviet side, the siege had become a source of mounting embarrassment. Despite overwhelming superiority, they had failed to take a town defended by a shrinking garrison. Reports from frontline commanders indicated fatigue, low morale, and growing reluctance among conscripted troops to engage in frontal attacks. Political officers attempted to enforce discipline and motivation, but desertion attempts increased. In some units, rumors spread that Kholm was being used as a test site for new German weapons, or that the defenders were protected by supernatural forces. The inability to explain their own failure created a psychological shadow that crept into every trench. By the end of April, the battle had entered a phase where neither side saw a clear path to resolution. The Germans could not break out. The Soviets could not break in. The Luftwaffe could not supply indefinitely. The question now was not who would win the siege, but how long the human body and human will could endure. Kholm had become a graveyard of expectations and a monument to the grim logic of attritional warfare. Every sunrise brought not hope, but another day of smoke, frost, and the endless whistle of incoming shells. By early May 1942, the siege of Kholm had reached a point of near-total physical and psychological exhaustion. The town, now reduced to a husk of smoldering ruins and cratered alleyways, was barely defensible in any traditional sense. The German defenders occupied what was essentially a network of isolated strongpoints, partially collapsed buildings, rubble-covered cellars, and trenches so shallow they offered little protection from shrapnel. Yet within this devastation, the garrison continued to adapt, fight, and, remarkably, survive. Each day brought new Soviet attempts to probe the perimeter, test the defenses, and harass the defenders into submission. Most assaults were local in scale: infantry squads advancing under mortar cover, sappers attempting to detonate barricades, snipers taking potshots at runners or exposed machine gun nests, These tactics did not aim for immediate breakthrough, but for erosion, attritional pressure designed to wear down the last vestiges of German resistance. Yet the defenders met each push with calculated, stubborn defiance. The perimeter, now barely a few hundred meters wide in some areas, continued to hold. Communication between Kholm and Army Group North remained intermittent. Radio contact was often disrupted by jamming or technical failure, and Scherer was forced to rely on pre-agreed transmission windows to coordinate with the outside. Messages sent from Kholm during this period reveal the growing desperation. Requests for painkillers, suture kits, barbed wire, replacement barrels for MG-34S, and increasingly, morphine and stretchers. What they received instead were crates of dried food, bandages, ammunition, and occasionally letters from Hitler or Göring praising their fortitude. Within the pocket, innovation and adaptation were no longer tactical advantages. They were the only way to continue functioning. German engineers constructed improvised mortars using scrap metal and scavenged Soviet shells. Medical personnel devised treatments using boiled herbs and repurposed vodka from local stores. Ammunition was redistributed constantly, with units rotating to fire only when absolutely necessary. Hand-to-hand combat training resumed underground, as grenades and bullets were now luxuries. Even watches and compasses were repurposed as signaling tools and improvised timers for traps. Weather played a pivotal role in the garrison's day-to-day survival. The spring thaw turned the streets into a swamp of melted snow, blood, and rubble. Movement became treacherous, and disease surged again as bacteria from buried corpses and waste seeped into every crevice. Still, German troops continued to dig trenches, reinforce firing positions, and carry out perimeter patrols. Sleep was fragmented and plagued by nightmares. Many men had not removed their boots in weeks. Exposure wounds were common, as were hallucinations brought on by hunger and fatigue. But desertion was virtually non-existent. The perimeter was too small, the stakes too high, and the consequences too certain. Morale remained tied to Scherer's leadership. Despite repeated injuries and illness, he continued to circulate among his men, issue handwritten orders, and lead from the front when necessary. He instituted new survival protocols: no unnecessary movements during daylight, double watch rotation at night, use of civilian chimneys to direct hot air into underground positions. He ordered the repair of damaged radios using salvaged copper wiring and personally ensured that at least one message per day reached the Luftwaffe with updated coordinates for supply drops. The civilians within the pocket now numbered fewer than 50. They no longer attempted to hide from the siege. They lived inside it, breathing its ash, hearing its howling artillery, and accepting its presence like the weather. Some were conscripted to help dig graves or distribute rations. Others simply clung to whatever corners of shelter they could find. Children were rarely seen in daylight. Entire families slept in animal stalls or basements alongside soldiers, separated only by a blanket or a stack of spent shell casings. On the Soviet side, the siege was increasingly seen as a political problem. Frontline officers were losing credibility among their men. Attacks on Kholm had become synonymous with senseless losses and grim repetition. Yet the Red Army could not afford to lift the siege. Doing so would constitute a psychological victory for the Germans and contradict months of official reports proclaiming imminent success. Thus, the Soviet strategy shifted again toward indirect pressure, isolation, starvation, and slow collapse. German aerial reconnaissance, however, brought new hope. Army Group North reported signs of Soviet troop redeployment in adjacent sectors. A corridor might soon be opened, not to fully relieve Kholm, but to bring it within supporting distance of advancing units. Scherer was informed of this possibility in coded transmissions, though no timeline was given. For the garrison, the promise of eventual rescue was not a guarantee, but it was enough to continue resisting. By mid-May, a surreal rhythm had taken hold. Life and death alternated by the hour. The sounds of mortar fire, crumbling walls, and screaming wounded had become background noise. Men ate, cleaned weapons, treated wounds, and wrote letters no one would read, often within sight of burning houses or corpses half submerged in spring mud. The siege no longer resembled a military engagement. It was an endurance trial. And the men who survived each day did so not out of ideology or duty alone, but because the alternative, to give in, was still unthinkable. By the final week of May 1942, the siege of Kholm approached a decisive inflection point. After 4 months of constant encirclement, the Red Army had failed to break the garrison, and the German defenders, though hollowed by attrition, disease, and hunger, remained defiant. Inside the ruins, only around 1,200 combat-capable soldiers remained, many of them wounded or chronically ill. Ammunition was low, rations reduced to starvation levels, and every building that could burn had already burned. And yet, the flag still flew over what remained of the German command post. The line had not broken. In Berlin, Hitler had begun referring to the defenders of Kholm as the embodiment of Germanic will, elevating them into legend even before the siege had ended. General Major Scherer, now gaunt and suffering from untreated wounds, was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves while still encircled. But inside the pocket, such honors meant little. What mattered was survival, of the town, of the men, and of the idea that resistance could endure even without hope of victory. The Soviets, too, began to recognize that time was no longer working in their favor. Strategic pressure on other sectors forced them to divert troops and artillery from the Kholm front to counter new German movements elsewhere, including a planned relief effort toward Demyansk. Reports from Soviet field commanders indicated that morale among attacking units was collapsing. The soldiers were exhausted, their equipment worn down, and their officers unsure whether continuing the siege was worth the growing losses. Soviet attempts to storm Kholm in early May had been repelled with such ferocity that some units simply refused to advance without armor or direct artillery support, resources now scarce due to redeployment. Amid this strategic shift, Army Group North finally acted. Under the cover of coordinated artillery fire and diversionary attacks to the east, a German relief column began to move toward Kholm from the direction of the Lovat River. The force was modest, composed of elements from neighboring divisions and supply battalions, but it was supported by air power and reinforced with assault pioneers trained for breakthrough operations. Their objective was not to defeat Soviet forces outright, but to punch a narrow corridor through which essential supplies and personnel could reach the town. On May 18th, the first signs of the relief operation reached the defenders. Radio messages indicated that contact was expected within days, and the Luftwaffe increased sorties to provide cover and updated coordinates. The men of Kholm prepared for the possibility of external contact. Positions were reinforced, signs painted on rooftops, and scouts dispatched beyond the inner perimeter to mark possible rendezvous points. Every remaining bullet was counted, and a final reserve of rations was distributed among the weakest defenders. On May 20th, German forward elements reached the outer ring of Soviet positions near Kholm. Clashes erupted along the approach routes, and though Soviet forces mounted a fierce resistance, they were now overstretched and undermanned. After 3 days of fighting, the relief column reached a ridgeline overlooking the southern edge of Kholm. Signal flares were exchanged, and on May 23rd, the first physical contact was made. A motorized patrol reached one of the town's southern barricades under cover of darkness, delivering food, medical supplies, and orders from high command. The Soviet forces, realizing that the siege had been breached, launched immediate counterattacks to sever the new corridor. Fighting raged for 48 hours, but the Germans held the narrow passage open long enough to establish a two-way line for resupply and potential evacuation. On May 27th, Scherer received word that the garrison was now considered relieved, though the surrounding region remained contested. Despite the breach, Scherer refused immediate withdrawal. He argued that abandoning Kholm would allow the Soviets to reclaim a symbolic victory. Instead, he ordered his men to maintain defensive positions while the wounded civilians and essential personnel were evacuated in stages. It would take several more days to complete the operation, and even then, many of the original defenders, now barely able to walk, refused to leave until ordered to do so directly. The Soviet command, unwilling to commit more resources to a now compromised objective, slowly pulled back from direct engagements. By the final day of May, the Red Army ceased active operations against Kholm, and the siege, one of the most grueling, prolonged engagements on the Eastern Front, was effectively over. The end of the siege did not bring peace or relief. Kholm was a wasteland of ash, mud, and corpses. Nothing of the original town remained intact. The cost of its defense was staggering. Over 3,000 dead or wounded, hundreds more suffering from permanent disability, and a civilian population decimated by starvation and shell fire. But the town had not fallen. Against all logic, against all odds, a force of a few thousand had held against the full weight of Soviet might for 105 days. And in doing so, they became a symbol, one of tragedy, resilience, and the terrible calculus of war. With the siege of Kholm officially lifted in early June 1942, the immediate task turned to securing the fragile relief corridor, evacuating the wounded, and assessing the cost of the prolonged encirclement. German forces established a tenuous buffer zone around the ruined town, but the surrounding area remained contested. Soviet units had not been annihilated, only redirected, and their presence in the forests and river valleys surrounding Kholm posed a constant threat to both supply convoys and patrols. Minefields, abandoned positions, and lingering sniper fire turned every kilometer beyond the town into a potential ambush site. Evacuation began in phases. The most critical cases, wounded soldiers, frostbite victims, and the remaining civilians, were transported out by stretcher, truck, or, when possible, short-range aircraft. The Luftwaffe resumed limited landings on the battered airstrip, though pilots still described the descent as perilous due to cratered runways and unpredictable crosswinds. Many of the injured did not survive the journey. Medical stations to the west were overwhelmed by the influx of half-starved, gangrenous, and psychologically shattered survivors, many of whom had not spoken in days or recognized their own names. For those who remained in Kholm, new orders were issued. General Major Scherer, despite his physical deterioration, insisted on restoring some semblance of military order. Ruined sectors were cleared of unexploded ordnance, and collapsed buildings searched for bodies. Graves were dug where possible, some communal, some hastily marked. The goal was not to make the town habitable again, but to bring closure to the nightmare that had unfolded within its bounds. Reports from returning officers painted a grim picture. Of the original garrison, fewer than 1,600 were still fit for duty. Supplies were depleted beyond replenishment, morale was hanging by threads, and equipment was unusable without major resupply. Yet despite these realities, the High Command in Berlin ordered the position to be held. Kholm, they believed, had become more than a tactical point. It was a symbol of German endurance, and symbols, in their view, could not be surrendered. Meanwhile, the Soviet command digested the implications of their failure. The inability to capture a lightly manned town, even after committing several divisions and months of resources, was viewed internally as a serious embarrassment. Units that had failed to breach the perimeter were quietly reassigned or dissolved. Political officers submitted reports blaming terrain, weather, and fanaticism of the German defenders. In reality, it had been a convergence of stubborn leadership, relentless air support, and ruthless discipline that allowed the garrison to endure. Moscow ordered that lessons be drawn for future sieges, especially regarding reliance on frontal assaults and underestimation of German improvisation under pressure. Strategically, the siege's outcome had limited impact on the broader war effort. Kholm was not a supply hub, industrial center, or communications node, but its psychological and symbolic weight far outweighed its geographic value. In Germany, it was paraded as a triumph of will over material, of spirit over steel. Photographs of gaunt, frost-bitten soldiers emerging from the ruins were published in newspapers across the Reich. Scherer was flown to Berlin in July and received personal honors from Hitler himself. A medal, the Kholm Shield, was created specifically for the defenders, to be worn as a mark of elite status. Inside military circles, however, opinions were more divided. Some commanders viewed the defense as a model of small unit resistance and aerial coordination. Others saw it as a costly fixation on symbolism that drained resources from more decisive theaters. The airlift alone, involving hundreds of sorties under fire, had required resources that could have been used to reinforce the front around Leningrad or Kharkov. Debate also surrounded the precedent set by the siege. By demonstrating that isolated pockets could survive indefinitely under air resupply, the High Command drew false confidence, one that would later influence disastrous decisions at Stalingrad. For the survivors, however, such debates were irrelevant. The men who had lived through Kholm bore permanent scars, physical, emotional, and psychological. Many were discharged shortly after the siege, deemed unfit for further duty. Others returned to the front, only to fall in later battles. Scherer himself never fully recovered and spent the remainder of the war removed from frontline command. The town they had defended so fiercely remained a ghost ruin for months, surrounded by wreckage, rusting artillery, and graves. Still, among both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, Kholm earned a strange kind of respect. For the Germans, it was proof of what could be endured. For the Soviets, it was a lesson in what could be resisted. In whispered tones and after-action reports, commanders on both sides referred to the siege not as a victory or defeat, but as a reminder that in war, endurance sometimes mattered more than strength, and that once committed, the human will could outlast even the most methodical siege. The legacy of the Siege of Kholm did not end with the final withdrawal of Soviet forces or the return of the defenders to German lines. Instead, it endured, etched into the collective memory of the war as one of its most punishing and improbable episodes. For the German military and political leadership, Kholm became a central element in the narrative of heroism against impossible odds. For the men who had endured it, it was something else entirely. A lesson in the brutal mathematics of survival, the fragility of the human body, and the thin line separating defiance from destruction. Almost immediately, the siege was mythologized. Nazi propaganda transformed the exhausted, emaciated survivors into icons of national strength. Speeches in the Reichstag, radio broadcasts, and newspaper editorials referred to the spirit of Kholm as a model for all German soldiers. Schools taught the story. Recruitment posters showed idealized depictions of trench-coated grenadiers standing unbroken amid ruins. Scherer's name was added to lists of the Reich's soldier heroes, and his reports from the siege were circulated within the officer corps as instructional material. Yet the internal Wehrmacht assessments told a more sobering story. The siege had required massive commitment of resources, hundreds of aircraft sorties, diversion of supply chains, and constant high-level coordination for a position that offered no lasting strategic value. The airlift, praised in public, had stretched Luftwaffe capacity and cost dozens of experienced pilots. Worse, it contributed to a false sense of feasibility regarding future air-supplied encirclements. This illusion would prove catastrophic at Stalingrad, where German command assumed that if a few thousand men at Kholm could be sustained, surely an entire army could as well. The broader military significance of the siege also sparked internal debate. On one level, it demonstrated the tactical resilience and adaptability of Wehrmacht forces. Kholm had revealed how a determined force, even one composed of rear-echelon troops and ad hoc formations, could resist overwhelming pressure when properly led and supplied. It showed the value of decentralized command, improvisation under fire, and flexible defensive planning. But it also exposed the limits of such endurance. Kholm had held, but only just, and the human cost had been staggering. Among Soviet historians and military thinkers, the siege became a case study in failure. It was analyzed not for the heroism of its defenders, but for the shortcomings of the Red Army. The inability to overwhelm a small, isolated garrison over the course of 105 days raised fundamental questions about Soviet infantry tactics, coordination between artillery and ground forces, and the logistical assumptions of encirclement warfare. Lessons were drawn, many of which were quietly incorporated into Soviet operations later in the war, particularly in the planning of urban assaults and containment strategies. In the years following the war, Kholm faded from broader public consciousness, overshadowed by larger battles, more decisive offensives, and more spectacular victories or defeats. But for military historians and veterans, it remained a pivotal episode, a moment when the brutality of the Eastern Front crystallized into a singular, horrifying clarity. Unlike the sweeping tank battles or the monumental sieges of Leningrad and Stalingrad, Kholm was intimate, claustrophobic, and unrelenting. It was a siege measured not in kilometers gained or lost, but in calories, bullets, and hours survived. In post-war Germany, former soldiers who had served at Kholm gathered occasionally, commemorating the ordeal not with triumphalism, but with solemnity. For them, the siege was not a matter of glory, but of grim endurance. Monuments erected in West Germany bore only the names of the fallen, not of the battle. In Russia, Kholm remained a symbol of early war frustration, one of the many places where the Red Army bled in its long, slow climb back toward eventual victory. Today, Kholm stands as a quiet town once more, with few visible traces of the apocalyptic siege that unfolded there. But beneath its soil lie the remains of thousands, soldiers and civilians, attackers and defenders, victims of frostbite and artillery alike. Their stories, silent and buried, speak to the deeper truths of war, that courage and cruelty often exist side by side, that survival is not always victory, and that history is built as much on what endured as on what was destroyed. In the end, the siege of Kholm became more than a military episode. It was a test of logistics, of leadership, of ideology, and most of all, of human limits. And in passing that test, it revealed both the potential and the price of unyielding resistance in the face of annihilation.